She boarded quietly, dressed with care, her steps measured and calm. The flight attendants barely looked at her as she settled into her seat in business class. But moments later, their tone changed. Papers were double-checked, her seat reassigned, and she was told it had been a mistake. As she gathered her things without protest, passengers glanced away, pretending not to see. No one knew her name, and no one understood who she really was. But they would. The Baton Rouge airport stirred awake with the first soft light of day. Rolling suitcases echoed across the polished floors, and the quiet hum of announcements blended into the rising tide of early departures. Families clustered near boarding gates, professionals moved briskly past security, and elderly travelers rested near terminal windows. Among them sat a woman in her mid-40s. She wore a beige tailored pantsuit, dark sunglasses, and a quiet composure that stood out in the crowd. At gate 14, she waited for her flight to Chicago, her boarding pass resting neatly in the side pocket of her bag. It indicated a window seat in business class. She neither checked her phone obsessively nor fidgeted with her belongings. Her presence was calm and still, as though nothing around her could disrupt the focus in her eyes. She watched the terminal with soft attentiveness, taking in the subtle rhythms of people in motion, the uniformed staff moving carts, the blinking screens announcing delays and departures. Her luggage was compact and efficient, much like her appearance. She gave the impression of someone accustomed to travel, someone who knew how to occupy space without demanding attention. When boarding began, she rose without haste. She walked with an unforced confidence, her step steady and balanced. The boarding agent glanced at her pass, scanned it, and waved her through with polite efficiency. As she stepped into the aircraft, she acknowledged the flight attendant at the door with a small, gracious nod. There was no effort to impress, no performance. It was simply how she moved through the world. Inside the cabin, she found her seat quickly, a window position in the second row of business class. She placed her bag carefully in the overhead bin, adjusted her coat on the back of the seat, and sat down with ease. Her motions were practiced, as though she had done this 100 times before. She fastened her seatbelt, took out a book from her leather tote, and began to read. The noise of other passengers, the shuffle of feet, the lifting of bags, none of it seemed to reach her. She existed in a space of quiet self-possession. As other travelers filed past her row, she remained motionless. A few glanced at her, perhaps noticing the contrast between her composed manner and the general rush around her. She didn't return their stares. Her attention stayed with the page in front of her, turning slowly from one line to the next. The flight attendants began moving down the aisle, checking seat belts and overhead compartments. Coffee machines clicked on in the galley. The intercom crackled with instructions about departure times and carry-on compliance. Through the window, the tarmac glowed with the morning sun, casting long shadows of fueling trucks and service carts. She paused for a moment to look outside, then returned to her book, her hand resting lightly on the armrest. There was nothing extraordinary about the moment. It was the kind of beginning that happened in airports across the country every day. But even in this ordinary setting, something about her stillness carried weight. She looked like a woman who had weathered many mornings like this one, not someone waiting to arrive somewhere, but someone who had already arrived. A few minutes after all passengers had taken their seats and the cabin had begun to settle into the quiet hum of pre-departure rituals, the atmosphere near row 2 shifted. A flight attendant, noticeably older than the rest, walked down the aisle with a clipboard in hand and a practiced expression that combined precision with condescension. Her posture was rigid, her eyes scanning quickly before they locked on the seated woman near the window. Without a greeting, she glanced at the boarding pass still resting in the woman's lap and asked her to confirm her seat assignment. Before the woman could respond, another crew member appeared, a younger man with a slim build, holding a digital tablet and a tight jaw. He leaned over, whispering something to the senior attendant. Both of them looked at the woman in a way that suggested not confusion but quiet suspicion. They examined her ticket again, checking it against a passenger manifest on the screen. She watched the exchange with stillness, her expression unchanged, her back straight against the seat. They began speaking more audibly now, citing a need to verify an internal discrepancy. The language was formal, the tone overly professional, but beneath it was a faint rigidity that betrayed something else. There was no hint of apology, no sense of ease. They were not addressing her as a valued customer, but as a potential error to be quietly corrected. The woman remained composed. She handed over her boarding pass without resistance and returned her hands to her lap. Her gaze did not follow their eyes. She sat still, eyes forward, as if already bracing herself for something she had seen before. Around her, a few passengers looked up. Some leaned back slightly to eavesdrop. A couple in the row ahead turned to observe. A young man across the aisle removed one earbud and tilted his head toward the conversation. Still, no one spoke. The cabin remained a zone of silence layered with private judgments. Some passengers furrowed their brows, others avoided eye contact altogether. The murmurs between crew members grew quieter again. The male attendant tapped rapidly on the tablet, lips pressed into a thin line. Finally, the woman's pass was returned with a clipped, "Thank you," but no clear resolution. The attendants moved a few steps away, yet remained close enough to keep her within sight. She did not open her book again. Instead, she turned her face toward the window, where the last bags were being loaded onto the cargo hold. Her hands rested in her lap, unmoving, her back never touching the seat. No accusations had been made. No confrontation had occurred. Yet the act of questioning her legitimacy in that seat, in that space, lingered in the air like an unspoken warning. Around her, passengers resumed their distractions, but the tension had already taken root. Something subtle had been disturbed. Something quiet, but unmistakable. A few minutes later, the same flight attendant returned, her expression sharpened by a layer of official detachment. In her hand was a new boarding pass, which she offered to the woman with a clipped explanation. There had been a booking discrepancy, she said. Due to a system error, the seat in business class had been assigned to another passenger, and the woman would need to relocate to a different seat in the main cabin. The explanation was thin, wrapped in formality and delivered without eye contact. The woman glanced at the new ticket. Her original seat number, near the front of the plane, had been replaced with a number far back in the aircraft, a stark contrast in both location and implication. She did not speak. She closed her book carefully, placed the original ticket back into her bag, and stood up. Her movements were deliberate, without any hint of haste or resistance. She reached up to retrieve her bag from the overhead bin, holding it close to her side. As she stepped into the aisle, the atmosphere around her shifted. The quiet hum of the cabin was momentarily disrupted. Heads turned. Some passengers stared openly, others looked away too quickly, feigning distraction. A few angled their phones discreetly to record. No one said a word, but the silence stretched, dense with unspoken observations. She walked down the aisle slowly, her step steady. Each row she passed felt like another stage, each glance another silent judgment. Her eyes did not scan the passengers. She kept them forward, fixed on the general direction of her new seat. Her back remained straight, her expression unchanged. There was no indignation in her posture, only a reserved stillness that carried more weight than any protest. When she reached the assigned seat in the economy section, she placed her bag beneath the seat in front of her, settled in, and folded her hands over her lap. The seat was narrower, the legroom tighter, the hum of the engine louder. The difference was palpable. Still, she retrieved her book again and opened it to the last page she had read. Around her, passengers shifted in their seats. Some tried to return to their routines, but the energy had changed. Even those who hadn't witnessed the earlier exchange could sense that something unsettling had occurred. A few rose up, a child whispered a question to a parent, who quickly hushed them. Meanwhile, the business class seat she had vacated was quickly occupied by a middle-aged white man in a navy blazer. He took the place without pause, without glancing back. One of the attendants offered him a beverage with a smile that hadn't been shown earlier. The woman in row 27A did not look back. The pages of her book turned slowly. From behind her sunglasses, her eyes remained focused, not on the words, but on something far beyond the lines of print. She had not raised her voice. She had not demanded attention. Yet every part of her presence continued to speak louder than the quiet around her. While the aircraft completed its final preparations for takeoff, a passenger seated near the front of the business class cabin uploaded a short video to social media. The footage showed the earlier moment when the woman was asked to relocate to the back of the plane, despite clearly holding a business class ticket. The video captured the exchange from a side angle, showing her quiet composure and the flight attendant's authoritative stance. The clip lasted only 45 seconds, but it spread with remarkable speed. Within 20 minutes, the video had been shared by several larger accounts. Comments flooded in. Viewers from across the country voiced outrage, identifying what appeared to be a clear act of racial profiling. Some users described experiencing similar treatment on flights. Others pointed out the professionalism of the woman's behavior in contrast to the dismissive tone of the crew. One comment, in particular, began gaining traction. It included a screenshot from a recent article featuring the same woman at a conference on transportation equity. Her name was tagged. She was not just another traveler. She was a board advisor to a civil rights nonprofit that had recently partnered with major transportation companies to promote fairness in service policies. The revelation sent the post into viral territory. The tone of the responses shifted. What had started as a simple post about an unfair seat reassignment turned into a broader conversation about corporate accountability, airline discrimination, and how often such incidents go unreported when the subject is not recognizable. Back inside the plane, none of this was visible. The cabin crew continued with their duties as if the earlier interaction had been routine. Beverages were served, safety announcements delivered, cabin lights adjusted. The flight attendants moved through the aisles with practiced efficiency. To them, the issue had been resolved the moment the woman accepted the new seat without protest. She remained seated in economy, still reading her book. Her posture was unchanged, her expression unreadable. She had not spoken about what happened. She had not contacted anyone, nor had she looked around to seek allies. Her silence, however, had not prevented others from taking notice. Even without her participation, the moment had begun to ripple outward far beyond the aircraft walls. At the airline's corporate office, a junior communications officer monitoring social channels noticed the sudden spike in mentions. Keywords like bias, mistreatment, and injustice began trending under the company's name. A quick review of the post revealed the source. The image of the woman being moved, frozen mid-frame, was being shared across multiple platforms with growing concern. Internal alerts were triggered. Screenshots were sent up the chain of command. By the time the plane reached cruising altitude, a small team had already begun drafting a preliminary response. Internally, they hoped the story would die down before reaching mainstream attention. But the involvement of a prominent figure from a justice organization made that unlikely. Still unaware of the brewing storm, the flight crew continued their rounds. The woman accepted a cup of water when offered. She nodded politely but did not initiate any further interaction. Across the aisle, a young man glanced at her, then quickly looked away. Behind her, a couple whispered about the earlier scene but kept their voices low. The aircraft's cabin was quiet, but a different kind of noise was building elsewhere, digital, insistent, and impossible to ignore. The people at 30,000 feet had no way of knowing how quickly the narrative was evolving below them. The event that had been intended to be silenced with a reassigned seat was now growing louder with every retweet, every post, every shared clip of her silent walk down the aisle. After the plane touched down at O'Hare International Airport in Chicago, the routine process of disembarking was briefly interrupted. Before passengers began collecting their bags and queuing in the aisle, a message was relayed to the flight crew from the airline's ground operations coordinator. The incident involving the woman, now widely circulated online, had caught the attention of senior executives. The video had been viewed hundreds of thousands of times within a few hours, and the backlash was already taking form. A decision had been made to initiate direct contact with the passenger. Discreetly, without making an announcement, the crew was instructed to delay the opening of the main cabin door. A uniformed representative from airport operations boarded the plane moments later. He walked directly to seat 21C where the woman was still seated, calm and silent. He bent slightly, spoke in a quiet, respectful tone, then gestured toward the front of the aircraft. She nodded once and rose, collecting her belongings without haste. She was escorted down the jet bridge and taken to a reserved area near the arrivals concourse, separated from the usual passenger traffic. The hallway was sterile and quiet, shielded from the growing digital storm outside. There, another representative awaited, this one from corporate affairs, with a badge clipped to her blazer and a file tucked under her arm. She introduced herself, offered a formal apology on behalf of the airline, and asked if the woman would be willing to provide a statement for an internal investigation. The tone was careful, rehearsed, and steeped in damage control. The woman listened but did not immediately reply. Instead, she took a seat and reviewed the form offered to her. She did not demand an explanation, nor did she raise her voice. She simply noted a few corrections in the document and returned it. Meanwhile, in the airline's main headquarters several states away, the public relations team scrambled to draft a press release. By the time it went live, the phrasing had been softened multiple times. The company described the seat reassignment as a regrettable miscommunication, attributing it to a procedural oversight in the cabin coordination system. They promised to review internal training protocols and stated that a formal apology had been delivered personally. But in the comments section beneath the release, users were already expressing doubt. Many pointed out that this was not the first such incident involving the airline. Others shared personal anecdotes of similar treatment. The hashtags #SeatReassigned and #SheBelongedThere were trending across multiple platforms. One comment summed up the public sentiment succinctly: she didn't need an apology. She needed to be treated right the first time. Journalists began reaching out to those who had posted the original video. News outlets requested interviews. A few media professionals, recognizing the woman from past features on transportation justice, confirmed her identity and published short profiles. It was no longer just a story about a seating issue. It had evolved into a reflection of something systemic, the subtle, pervasive ways respect is given or withheld based on appearance alone. At the gate where the plane had landed, the scene slowly returned to normal. Passengers retrieved their bags and moved toward the exit. Most had no idea of the internal communications taking place just a few doors down. Yet those who had noticed the incident aboard, and those who had filmed it, carried with them an unshakable impression of what had occurred. Even if the airline tried to minimize it, the moment was now part of the public consciousness. In a nearby terminal cafe, two travelers re-watched the video together, discussing it in hushed tones. Across the airport, others checked their phones and saw the woman's face now familiar in headlines. Some simply stared in silence. In the lounge reserved for business-class passengers, an older couple who had witnessed the situation discussed what they had seen, realizing only now who the woman was. One of them admitted they had felt something was wrong but hadn't known how to react at the time. For the airline, the fallout had only just begun. For the woman, the flight was over, but the consequences of that quiet moment in seat 21C were still unfolding, gathering momentum with every refresh of the screen. 2 days later, the airline released a second official statement. Unlike the previous generic response, this one acknowledged the woman's full status as a confirmed business-class passenger, included a direct apology, and confirmed that one of the crew members involved had been placed on temporary administrative leave pending further investigation. The statement also announced the implementation of a new passenger engagement protocol. This initiative, framed as a pilot program to improve fairness and inclusivity in customer interactions, was being developed in partnership with a national transportation justice organization, the very one where the woman held an advisory position. The announcement received mixed reactions. Some commended the airline for taking action. Others remained skeptical, pointing out that only after public exposure and pressure had any meaningful steps been taken. In digital spaces, the original video continued to circulate, now accompanied by short follow-ups and user commentary. The woman herself did not issue a public response, did not grant interviews, and did not appear in any press materials. But her silence had already spoken volumes. Within a week, subtle changes began to manifest on the airline's most visible routes. Flight attendants were observed being more deliberate in their interactions. Reassigned seats now required approval from senior cabin staff and included documented justifications. Reports surfaced of passengers being proactively upgraded, not for status or appearance, but to correct prior oversights. The specific aircraft on which the incident occurred was rotated back into regular service. However, some travelers deliberately booked seats on that plane, recognizing its tail number from the video. A new pattern of passenger behavior emerged. People who might once have overlooked certain moments of bias or quietly accepted inconvenience now felt emboldened to ask questions, to record, to speak up. Inside the company, a broader internal audit was quietly initiated. Flight crews were invited to confidential training workshops, not as punishment but as part of a shift toward a new standard. Supervisors reported a spike in voluntary participation. The tone of internal memos changed, from reactive to reflective. Several junior staff members, previously hesitant to report discrimination or misconduct, came forward with observations, encouraged by the response to the incident. Across terminals, a noticeable shift occurred in the cultural undercurrent of airport life. It wasn't loud. There were no banners or campaigns. But it was there. A gate agent held eye contact longer. A security officer addressed a nervous traveler with unexpected gentleness. A flight attendant offered assistance without assumption. The woman, meanwhile, had returned to her usual work. She attended scheduled meetings, reviewed grant proposals, and prepared upcoming reports. In private, colleagues noted that she carried herself with the same composed clarity as always. Yet something had shifted around her, not in her voice, but in how others listened. At the next board meeting of her organization, a motion was passed to offer pro bono advisory services to airlines willing to reform passenger interaction protocols. The initiative was named after the gate where her flight had boarded. Internally, they called it the B9 Accord. Months later, when asked at a closed conference how the event had impacted her, the woman replied simply that she had done what anyone would do when treated unfairly: she had stayed seated. The room was silent for several seconds before quiet applause began. No one needed her to elaborate. From that point forward, her story was taught in training modules not just for airline staff but also for professionals in hospitality and customer relations across sectors. It became a reference, a reminder that dignity requires no spectacle. In airports across the country, passengers continued to board flights. Most never knew the full story behind the quiet shift in tone, the increased awareness, or the slightly different way they were greeted. But the people who needed to remember did. And in the quiet spaces of air travel, a new kind of attention had taken root. One rooted not in fear of exposure, but in recognition of shared responsibility. Change had not arrived with a confrontation. It had come with stillness, with composure, with presence. And it remained, because one woman, on one morning, had refused to disappear into the noise.